December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor climbed from the cockpit of his bullet-riddled P-40 Warhawk, his hands still trembling from adrenaline. Behind him, the harbor burned with an intensity that turned morning into twilight. He had just engaged Japanese aircraft in a desperate scramble, managing to shoot down 2 attackers before his ammunition ran dry. But what haunted him was not the destruction spread across Ford Island or the battleships capsizing in the harbor. It was the aircraft he had fought against. The Japanese fighters moved through the sky with a grace that seemed impossible. They turned inside every maneuver he attempted, climbed away when he tried to pursue, and danced around his P-40 as if it were standing still. Taylor was an experienced pilot, trained in the latest tactics, flying what was supposed to be a frontline fighter, yet he had been completely outclassed. The Japanese aircraft, which he would later learn was called the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, represented a level of performance American intelligence had dismissed as impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. As he watched smoke columns rise from the ruined harbor, Taylor understood a terrible truth. America had entered a war for which it was desperately unprepared, and the skies over the Pacific belonged entirely to Japan. Within 18 months, that equation would be reversed so completely that Japanese pilots would enter combat already resigned to their deaths. The transformation would be so total that American fighters would achieve kill ratios approaching 20-1, systematically destroying 3/4 of Japan's entire air force in the Pacific theater. The weapon that would accomplish this reversal did not yet exist on that December morning, but the industrial machinery that would create it was already beginning to turn, driven by a recognition that incremental improvements would not be sufficient. America needed a fighter that could not merely match the Zero, but dominate it so thoroughly that Japanese air superiority would be crushed beyond recovery. The story of how that happened, how a single aircraft type transformed American naval aviation from humiliating defeat to overwhelming dominance in less than 2 years, reveals the intersection of industrial capacity, tactical intelligence, and engineering excellence that decided the Pacific War. January 8, 1942. Cavite Naval Base, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell watched Japanese bombers reduce the American naval facility to rubble. The attack was methodical, systematic, and utterly unopposed. American fighters that might have intercepted the raid had been destroyed on the ground days earlier. Those few aircraft that did manage to engage the Zero escorts were quickly shot down. McCampbell, who would later become the Navy's leading ace, was not yet flying combat missions. He was a training officer, evacuated from the Philippines aboard one of the last ships to escape Manila Bay. But he carried with him detailed reports from pilots who had faced the Zero in combat, and those reports painted a terrifying picture. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outrange every American fighter in the Pacific theater. It was flown by pilots with hundreds of combat hours gained during years of fighting in China, men who executed aerobatic maneuvers with casual precision. American pilots, many of them flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes or Bell P-39 Airacobras, stood virtually no chance in individual combat. Even the Navy's best carrier fighter, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, was badly outmatched. The Wildcat was rugged and well-armed, but it was slower than the Zero, climbed more poorly, and could not follow the Japanese fighter through its remarkable turning radius. Combat reports from the early months of 1942 told a consistent story. American fighters dove to attack Japanese formations, made a single firing pass, then fled before Zeros could respond. Any American pilot foolish enough to enter a turning fight with a Zero was dead. The official tactical doctrine became depressingly simple. Run away. Do not engage unless you have overwhelming altitude advantage. Do not attempt to dogfight. Use your aircraft's diving speed to escape, and hope the Zero pilot does not pursue. This was not a sustainable strategy for winning a war. It was a prescription for survival against a superior opponent, a holding action until something better could be fielded. And in early 1942, nothing better existed. The Zero was lighter, more maneuverable, and longer ranged than anything America could produce. It represented a fundamentally different design philosophy, one that prioritized performance over protection, accepting vulnerability in exchange for aerial superiority. The Japanese design approach made perfect sense given their strategic requirements. Japan needed fighters that could escort bombers across vast expanses of ocean, engage enemy aircraft far from their carriers, and dominate in close combat where pilot skill could be fully utilized. The Zero accomplished all of this brilliantly. It could remain airborne for over 6 hours, giving it an operational radius exceeding 900 miles. Its lightweight, barely 5,500 pounds fully loaded, gave it extraordinary acceleration and climb performance. Its large wing area and careful aerodynamic design allowed it to turn inside any opponent, but that performance came at a terrible price. The Zero had no armor protecting the pilot. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing, meaning any puncture would leak gasoline that could ignite from tracer rounds or engine heat. The airframe structure used minimum-gauge aluminum, strong enough for normal flight loads but unable to withstand battle damage. A burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire that would merely damage an American fighter could tear a Zero apart or ignite it catastrophically. American intelligence in early 1942 did not fully understand these vulnerabilities. They knew the Zero was dangerous, but they did not yet know it was fragile. They knew it was maneuverable, but they had not identified the specific tactical weaknesses that could be exploited. They knew it was fast, but they had not measured its actual top speed or tested its performance at high altitudes. What they had were scattered combat reports from pilots who had barely survived encounters, plus a few blurry photographs and some wreckage recovered from crash sites. The psychological impact of the Zero went beyond its technical capabilities. American pilots had been trained to believe their aircraft were the best in the world, that American engineering and industrial might guaranteed superiority. The Zero shattered that assumption. For the first time since the First World War, American aviators faced an opponent who was simply better equipped. The shock of that realization rippled through the entire naval aviation community. February 20th, 1942, Darwin, Australia. Japanese carrier aircraft, including 45 Zeros, attacked the Australian port in a raid larger than Pearl Harbor. The few Allied fighters that rose to intercept were annihilated. P-40 Warhawks attempting to defend the harbour were shot down in flames, their pilots never having a chance to engage effectively. The Zeros performed exactly as they had over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Malaya. They were unstoppable. But while Japanese pilots celebrated another victory, American engineers and naval planners were already racing to develop a response. The challenge was enormous. America needed a carrier fighter that could be produced in massive quantities, operated by pilots with limited training, capable of long-range missions, heavily armed, and survivable in combat. It needed to match or exceed the Zero's performance in most categories, while being fundamentally different in design, philosophy. And it needed to reach combat squadrons as quickly as possible, because every month of delay meant more American defeats, more pilots lost, more carriers at risk. The answer would come from Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a company with a reputation for building tough, reliable naval aircraft. Grumman's designers had been working on a replacement for the F-4F Wildcat since mid-1941, before Pearl Harbor, before the Zero's capabilities were fully understood. The initial design, designated XF6F1, was conceived as an improved Wildcat, larger and more powerful but essentially evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Then came the combat reports from the Pacific. Grumman's engineers realized that evolutionary improvements would not be sufficient. The new fighter needed to be transformational, a quantum leap in capability that could reverse American fortunes in the air war. That recognition would drive decisions that transformed the F-6F from a promising design into the weapon that would break Japanese air power. March 19th, 1942. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Bethpage, Long Island, New York. Chief Engineer William Schwendler spread the latest combat reports across his desk and tried to make sense of the contradictory information. Some reports claimed the Zero was faster than any American fighter. Others suggested it was actually slower than the Wildcat in level flight. Some pilots reported the Zero could climb to 20,000 feet in under 5 minutes. Others thought that was impossible given the engine power intelligence estimated. What was consistent across all reports was the Zero's devastating effectiveness in combat. It was killing American and Allied pilots at an alarming rate, and no tactical doctrine yet developed could consistently counter it. Schwendler and his team, including chief designer Jake Swerbel and company founder Leroy Grumman, faced a dilemma. They were designing the XF-6F1 around a Wright R2 600 Cyclone engine producing 1,700 horsepower, a significant increase over the Wildcat's 1,200 horsepower. But would that be enough? The preliminary calculations suggested the XF-6F1 would be faster than the Wildcat and climb better, but it would still be heavier and less maneuverable than the Zero. American designers could not match Japanese weight savings because they were committed to protecting their pilots with armor plate, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust structure. That philosophy was non-negotiable. American naval aviation would not sacrifice pilot survivability for performance, even if it meant accepting an aircraft that could not turn with the Zero. But Schwendler worried that the performance gap might be too large. If the XF-6F1 was only marginally better than the Wildcat, it might not be enough to change the tactical situation in the Pacific. American pilots would still be fighting at a disadvantage, still running away rather than engaging, still losing battles they should win. The solution came from multiple sources converging simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare, fresh from earning the Medal of Honor for single-handedly defending the carrier Lexington against Japanese bombers, visited Grumman in late April 1942. O'Hare had extensive combat experience against Zeros, having survived multiple engagements through a combination of aggressive tactics and sheer luck. His recommendations were direct and urgent. American fighters needed more power, better climb rate, improved visibility, and overwhelming firepower. Incremental improvements were not sufficient. The new fighter needed to be able to dictate the terms of combat, engaging when conditions favored it and disengaging before the Zero's turning advantage could be brought to bear. O'Hare's visit came at a crucial moment. Grumman was finalizing the XF-6F1 design, and changes could still be incorporated relatively easily. His combat experience provided validation for what Schwendler's team already suspected. They needed more power. The question was how much more, and whether the airframe could handle it. April 26, 1942. The Bureau of Aeronautics made a decision that would define the F-6F Hellcats' character. Based on O'Hare's recommendations and ongoing combat reports, they directed Grumman to abandon the Wright R2 600 engine and install the more powerful Pratt & Whitney R2 800 double Wasp in the second prototype. This was the same engine powering the Vought F-4U Corsair and Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and it produced 2,000 horsepower, a 50% increase over the original XF-6F1 design. The engine change required significant redesign of the XF-6F. The R2 800 was larger and heavier than the Wright Cyclone, requiring modifications to the engine mount, cowling, cooling system, and forward fuselage structure. The center of gravity shifted, requiring adjustments to the wing position and tail surfaces. The additional power meant the propeller and landing gear would experience higher loads, requiring strengthening throughout the airframe. But the performance gains would be worth the development delays. Grumman's calculations suggested the R2 800 powered variant would be approximately 25% faster than the original design, with dramatically improved climb rate and acceleration. More importantly, the additional power would give American pilots the ability to dictate engagement terms. They could climb above Zeros, dive to attack with speed advantage, and zoom back to altitude before the more maneuverable Japanese fighters could respond. This was the tactical doctrine that would eventually be called boom and zoom, and the F-6F's design was being optimized specifically to execute it. The aircraft would not try to match the Zero's turning performance. Instead, it would exploit different advantages, speed, climb rate, dive performance, and firepower, to win through superior energy management rather than maneuverability. June 26, 1942. The first XF-6F1 prototype, still powered by the Wright Cyclone engine, made its maiden flight with test pilot Robert Hall at the controls. The flight went smoothly, demonstrating good handling characteristics and no serious vices. But Hall's report confirmed what Grumman already suspected. The aircraft's performance, while improved over the Wildcat, was not dramatically superior. With the Cyclone engine, the XF-6F would be a good fighter but not a great one, certainly not the war-winning weapon the Navy desperately needed. 8 days later, on June 4th, the Battle of Midway would validate the desperate need for a fighter that could dominate the Zero. American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese carriers in a stunning reversal of fortune. But the air combat remained decidedly in Japan's favor. Zero fighters shot down dozens of American aircraft, including nearly an entire torpedo bomber squadron. The Wildcat fighters providing escort did their best, but they were still badly outmatched in individual combat. The Battle of Midway was a strategic victory for the United States, but it demonstrated that carrier warfare would be won by whoever controlled the air above the fleet, and in June 1942, that control belonged to Japan. The Zero remained the superior fighter, and American pilots remained at a disadvantage. Something had to change, and it had to change quickly. July 30th, 1942. The second XF-6F prototype, designated XF-6F3 and powered by the 2,000 horsepower R2-800 engine, lifted off from Grumman's Bethpage facility with test pilot Bob Hall once again at the controls. The difference was immediately apparent. The XF-6F3 accelerated down the runway with impressive eagerness, lifting off after a remarkably short ground roll. The climb rate was exceptional, far exceeding the performance of either the Wildcat or the first XF-6F1 prototype. Hall put the aircraft through a series of test maneuvers, carefully exploring its flight envelope. The additional power transformed every aspect of the aircraft's performance. Maximum speed exceeded 380 miles per hour, making it faster than the Zero in level flight. Rate of climb approached 3,000 feet per minute, competitive with the Japanese fighter despite the F-6F's much greater weight. Dive speed was excellent, and the aircraft remained controllable at high speeds where lighter fighters' control surfaces would become ineffective. Most importantly, the XF-6F3 felt solid. It was not a fragile thoroughbred requiring careful handling. It was a rugged warhorse that could absorb mistakes, survive battle damage, and still bring its pilot home. The heavy structure that made it less maneuverable than the Zero also made it survivable in ways the Japanese fighter could never match. But Hall's test flight revealed something even more important than raw performance numbers. The XF-6F3 was easy to fly. It had no vicious tendencies, no quirks that could kill an unwary pilot. The controls were well harmonized, responsive but not twitchy. Visibility from the raised cockpit was exceptional, with the pilot positioned high enough to see clearly over the nose during carrier approaches. This was crucial because the Navy was about to expand rapidly, flooding operational squadrons with newly trained pilots who had perhaps 200 hours of flight time, barely a quarter of what pre-war naval aviators received. The F-6F needed to be forgiving enough that these inexperienced pilots could operate it safely while learning combat tactics under fire. Grumman had designed the aircraft with this requirement foremost in their minds. Every aspect of the F-6F's handling was optimized for pilot-friendly characteristics. The landing gear was wide-set and robust, capable of absorbing hard carrier landings that would collapse lesser aircraft. The stall characteristics were benign, giving clear warning before braking. The engine-out handling was predictable, allowing single-engine landings without excessive difficulty. These qualities might seem mundane compared to speed and firepower, but they would prove absolutely critical to the F-6F's success. An aircraft that was easy to fly meant pilots could focus on tactics and situational awareness rather than wrestling with their machine. It meant training accidents would be reduced, keeping precious pilots alive to reach combat. It meant that in the chaos of a dogfight, pilots could trust their aircraft to respond predictably to control inputs. August 19, 1942. Japanese forces had established themselves on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, building an airfield that threatened Allied supply lines to Australia. American Marines landed on the island on August 7th, capturing the partially completed airfield in a surprise assault. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But holding Guadalcanal would require sustained air cover, and that meant carrier-based fighters engaging Zeros on a daily basis. The campaign that followed would demonstrate both the Wildcats' limitations and the desperate need for something better. Marine and Navy Wildcats operating from Henderson Field, the captured Japanese airbase, fought a brutal campaign of attrition against Japanese bombers and Zero escorts flying down from Rabaul. The American pilots were outnumbered, often outmaneuvered, and fighting with aircraft that were marginally inferior to the opposition. They survived through aggressive tactics, superior marksmanship, and the Wildcats' rugged construction. But the losses mounted steadily. Major John Smith, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 223, developed tactics that would later influence F-6F doctrine. He trained his pilots to fight in pairs, with wingmen covering each other and never allowing themselves to be drawn into individual turning fights. When Zeros approached, Wildcat pilots would execute the Thach Weave, a defensive maneuver where two fighters crossed paths repeatedly, forcing any pursuing Zero to face head-on fire from the other Wildcat. These tactics worked, keeping losses manageable and allowing Wildcats to score victories against superior numbers. But they were fundamentally defensive, designed to survive rather than dominate. Smith's pilots could protect themselves and occasionally shoot down Zeros, but they could not sweep Japanese fighters from the skies. The strategic situation remained precarious, with air superiority contested rather than controlled. Reports from Guadalcanal reached Grumman and the Bureau of Aeronautics throughout the fall of 1942. The message was clear. The F-6F needed to be tough enough to survive intense combat, heavily armed enough to destroy Zeros quickly, and fast enough to engage or disengage at will. The current design met those requirements, but production needed to begin immediately. Every month of delay meant more pilots fighting in Wildcats, more casualties, more desperate battles for air control. October 3, 1942. The first production F-6F-3 Hellcat made its maiden flight. Just 99 days had passed since the second prototype's first flight, an astonishingly short development cycle that reflected the program's urgency. Grumman had rushed the aircraft through testing, incorporating lessons learned from the prototypes while simultaneously preparing production tooling. The company built a new factory specifically for F-6F production, with assembly lines designed for maximum efficiency. The production ramp-up was unlike anything in aviation history. Grumman hired thousands of workers, many of them women with no previous aircraft manufacturing experience. Training programs taught them to rivet, wire, and assemble complex components. Quality control inspectors checked every detail, knowing that lives depended on their work. Suppliers across the country retooled to produce F-6F components, from landing gear struts to radio equipment to the thousands of rivets holding each airframe together. By December 1942, Grumman was producing 12 F-6F Hellcats per day. That number would increase steadily throughout 1943, reaching a peak of more than 20 aircraft per day by late in the year. Each Hellcat required approximately 20,000 individual parts sourced from hundreds of subcontractors. The Pratt and Whitney engines came from 3 separate factories. The propellers were manufactured by Hamilton Standard in Connecticut. The radios came from RCA. The guns were Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 6 per aircraft, with ammunition belts holding 400 rounds per gun. The scale was staggering, a testament to American industrial capacity operating at wartime intensity. Japan, fighting a war across millions of square miles of ocean, could not hope to match this production rate. Their factories were smaller, their supply chains more fragile, their workforce less mechanized. While Grumman produced dozens of Hellcats per week, Japanese factories struggled to produce dozens of Zeros per month. The mathematical inevitability of American victory was being manufactured on assembly lines in Bethpage, New York, January 16, 1943. Fighting Squadron 9, based at Naval Air Station Atlantic City, received the first operational F-6, F-3 Hellcats. The squadron's pilots, many of them combat veterans from earlier Pacific campaigns, gathered around the new fighters with mixture of curiosity and anticipation. They had heard rumors about the F-6F's performance, but seeing the aircraft in person was different. It was larger than the Wildcat, bulkier, with a massive engine cowling that made it look brutish rather than elegant. The pilots climbed into the cockpits and immediately noticed the difference. The seat was comfortable, positioned high with excellent visibility in all directions. The instrument panel was clearly laid out with all essential gauges easily readable. The control stick fell naturally to hand, and the rudder pedals were properly positioned. This was an aircraft designed by people who understood what pilots needed. Commander Philip Torrey, the squadron commander, took the first training flight. He advanced the throttle and felt the R2-800 engine's enormous power pushing him back into the seat. The Hellcat accelerated rapidly, lifting off with authority. Torrey climbed to altitude and began exploring the aircraft's handling. It was responsive but stable, powerful but forgiving. He put it through a series of aerobatic maneuvers, testing its limits. The Hellcat rolled cleanly, looped smoothly, and recovered from dives without tendency to overspeed or buffet. Most importantly, it felt fast. Torrey had flown Wildcats extensively, and the difference was night and day. The F-6F had power reserves the Wildcat could never match. When he opened the throttle, the aircraft surged forward with impressive acceleration. When he pulled back on the stick, it climbed steeply without losing speed. This was an aircraft that could dictate the terms of combat, choosing when to fight and when to break off. After landing, Torrey gathered his pilots and delivered a simple message. This aircraft will win the war. It's faster than the Zero, climbs better than anything we've flown, and it's tough enough to take hits and keep flying. Learn to use its strengths. Don't try to turn with Zeros, use speed and altitude. Hit them hard and fast, then climb away before they can respond. Trust the aircraft, and it will bring you home. Fighting Squadron 9 spent the next 6 weeks training intensively with the F-6F. Pilots practiced gunnery, carrier landings, navigation, and formation flying. They studied intelligence reports about Zero tactics and capabilities. They learned the boom and zoom technique that would become standard doctrine for F-6F operations. Dive from altitude to build speed, make a high-speed firing pass, then zoom back up using momentum and engine power before the enemy can react. The doctrine was simple but required discipline. Pilots had to resist the temptation to stay and dogfight after making their attack. They had to trust that speed and altitude were more valuable than trying to maneuver with a more agile opponent. They had to work as teams, with wingmen covering each other and setting up coordinated attacks that gave Zeros no chance to exploit their turning advantage. February 24, 1943, Fighting Squadron 9 embarked aboard the new carrier USS Essex, one of the first of the Essex-class fast carriers that would form the backbone of American naval power for the rest of the war. The Essex-class carriers were larger than previous designs, capable of carrying over 80 aircraft and operating at speeds exceeding 30 knots. They were designed specifically to support offensive operations deep into Japanese-controlled waters, and they would need fighter cover that could protect them from enemy air attack. The combination of Essex-class carriers and F-6F Hellcats would prove to be the decisive weapons system of the Pacific War. The carriers provided mobile air bases that could strike anywhere across thousands of miles of ocean. The Hellcats provided air superiority that allowed those strikes to proceed without facing overwhelming opposition. Together, they gave the United States the ability to project power in ways Japan could not counter. May 27, 1943. Marcus Island, a small coral atoll, roughly 1,000 miles northwest of Wake Island. The island had limited strategic value, but served as a useful target for testing new tactics and aircraft. Task Force 50, built around the carriers Essex and Yorktown, approached the island before dawn. Both carriers carried F-6F Hellcats, and this would be the new fighter's first combat test. At 0530 hours, the carriers launched their strike groups. Hellcats formed the fighter escort, climbing to altitude while dive bombers and torpedo planes formed up below. The formation headed toward Marcus Island through the pre-dawn darkness, crews tense and alert. Intelligence suggested the island had minimal air defenses, but no one knew for certain what opposition they might face. As the strike group approached Marcus Island, the sun rose behind them, illuminating the target. The island was smaller than most pilots expected, barely more than a mile long, with a single airfield and supporting facilities. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the American aircraft began their attack runs, filling the sky with bursting shells. But no Japanese fighters rose to intercept. The defending aircraft had either been evacuated or destroyed on the ground before they could launch. The Hellcats circled overhead while bombers attacked the airfield and facilities below. Several made strafing runs, their 650 caliber machine guns tearing up parked aircraft and buildings. The concentrated firepower was devastating, far exceeding what Wildcats could deliver. Pilots marveled at how much destruction their guns inflicted with short bursts. This was the kind of overwhelming advantage they had needed since Pearl Harbor. The strike group returned to the carriers without losses, and the Hellcat pilots landed aboard Essex and Yorktown with their aircraft unmarked by enemy fire. The mission had been a success, but it had not provided the crucial test everyone wanted. How would the F-6F perform against Zeros in actual combat? That question would be answered soon enough. August 31st, 1943. The answer came over Marcus Island during a second strike. This time, Japanese fighters were present, and the engagement that followed would provide the first real test of Hellcat versus Zero. Lieutenant Richard Loesch, flying from Essex with Fighting Squadron 5, spotted a formation of Zeros climbing to intercept the American bombers. He rolled into a dive, accelerating to well over 300 miles per hour, and opened fire on the trailing Zero from directly astern. The concentrated stream of 50 caliber bullets struck the Zero's fuselage and left wing. The Japanese fighter staggered, trailing smoke, then burst into flames and fell away. Loesch had fired for perhaps 3 seconds, expending maybe 200 rounds. The Zero had disintegrated under the impact. This was the confirmation everyone had been waiting for. The Hellcats' firepower could destroy Zeros quickly and decisively. Other engagements followed throughout the day. Hellcats dove on Japanese formations, shot down individual fighters, and climbed back to altitude before the surviving Zeros could retaliate. The American pilots followed their training perfectly, using speed and altitude to control the engagement. They did not try to turn with the more maneuverable Zeros. They simply dove, fired, and climbed away, repeating the process until the Japanese broke off and retreated. By the end of the day, Hellcat pilots claimed 6 Zero fighters destroyed for no losses. The kill ratio was 6-0, a complete reversal of the early war situation when Zeros routinely shot down multiple American fighters for each loss. More importantly, the Hellcat pilots returned to their carriers confident and enthusiastic. They had faced the legendary Zero and found it was not invincible. Their aircraft was faster, better armed, and could survive hits that would have destroyed the fragile Japanese fighter. November 20th, 1943. The Gilbert Islands operation would provide a much larger test of the Hellcats' capabilities. The American invasion of Tarawa and Makin atolls required sustained air cover over the landing beaches, and Japanese air forces based at Rabaul and Truk were expected to interfere. Task Force 53, centered around 6 carriers carrying F-6F Hellcats, positioned itself to provide that cover and intercept any Japanese counterattacks. The Japanese responded with determination. They launched strikes from land bases, sending dozens of bombers escorted by Zero fighters to attack the American fleet and invasion beaches. The strikes represented Japan's best remaining air strength in the region, including veteran pilots and relatively new aircraft. This would be the Hellcats' first major battle against significant opposition. On November 23rd, radar aboard the American carriers detected a large formation of Japanese aircraft approaching from the northwest. Fighting squadrons from Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence launched immediately, climbing to intercept. Over 40 Hellcats formed a layered defense, positioned at various altitudes to catch the Japanese formation regardless of their approach path. The Japanese strike consisted of approximately 30 torpedo bombers and an equal number of Zero escorts. They approached at low altitude, hoping to slip under the American combat air patrol and attack the carriers directly. But the radar-directed intercept brought Hellcats into position perfectly. The American fighters dove on the Japanese formation from multiple directions, tearing into the bombers before the Zero escorts could react. Lieutenant Alexander Wratsiu, flying from Independence, found himself positioned ahead of the Japanese formation with perfect altitude advantage. He rolled into a diving attack, selecting a torpedo bomber and opening fire from 400 yards. His 6 guns converged on the target, and the bomber exploded spectacularly, breaking apart in mid-air. Wratsiu pulled up, selected another target, and fired again. Another bomber fell away trailing flames. He repeated the process 4 more times in less than 6 minutes, destroying 6 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement. Other Hellcat pilots achieved similar success. The disciplined boom and zoom attacks shredded the Japanese formation, shooting down bombers faster than the Zero escorts could respond. When Zeros did manage to engage, the Hellcats simply dove away, using their superior speed to escape before the Japanese fighters could get their sights aligned. Then the Hellcats would climb back to altitude and attack again, repeating the cycle until the Japanese were forced to retreat or were all shot down. The battle lasted approximately 30 minutes. When it ended, American pilots claimed over 30 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Only a handful of Japanese bombers managed to reach the fleet, and none scored effective hits. The Hellcats had destroyed an entire Japanese strike force with minimal losses. 3 Hellcats were shot down, but 2 of the pilots were rescued from the ocean. The kill ratio was approximately 10-1 in favor of the Americans. The psychological impact was profound on both sides. American pilots realized they had complete tactical superiority. Their aircraft was better, their tactics were better, and their training was better. Japanese pilots, by contrast, faced a terrible realization. The Zero was no longer the dominant fighter in the Pacific. The Americans had fielded something that could beat them consistently, and there was no Japanese response in development that could restore the balance. January through May, 1944. The tempo of operations increased dramatically as American forces pushed deeper into the Pacific. Carrier task forces struck Japanese bases at Truk, Palau, and throughout the Caroline Islands. Hellcats flew hundreds of sorties, sweeping aside Japanese air opposition and allowing bombers to destroy ships, aircraft, and facilities with minimal interference. The production lines at Grumman continued accelerating. By early 1944, the company was producing over 500 Hellcats per month, an almost unimaginable rate of output. The Navy was receiving aircraft faster than it could train pilots to fly them. New squadrons formed constantly, each equipped with brand-new F-6 F-3s straight from the factory. The numerical imbalance was becoming as significant as the qualitative advantage. Japan, meanwhile, struggled desperately to replace losses. Zero production continued, but the aircraft was increasingly obsolete. Japanese engineers had developed improved fighters, the Kawanishi N-1KJ Shiden and the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden. But these reached frontline units in small numbers, and too late to affect the strategic situation. More critically, Japan was losing pilots faster than training programs could replace them. The experienced veterans who had dominated early war combat were dead, and their replacements had perhaps 1/3 the training hours. By mid-1944, many Japanese pilots entering combat had fewer than 100 hours total flight time, barely enough to safely land on a carrier. These inexperienced pilots flying obsolete aircraft faced American pilots with 300 to 400 hours of training flying the most advanced carrier fighter in the world. The outcome was predetermined before combat even began. June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet, 9 aircraft carriers carrying over 400 aircraft. This was the largest concentration of Japanese naval air power assembled since the Battle of Midway 2 years earlier. Ozawa's mission was to destroy the American invasion fleet attacking Saipan, preventing the loss of the Marianas, which would bring the Japanese home islands within range of American B-29 bombers. Facing Ozawa was Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell. The American force consisted of 7 large fleet carriers and 8 light carriers carrying over 900 aircraft, including over 400 F-6F Hellcats. The numerical advantage was overwhelming, but the quality advantage was even more significant. American pilots were experienced and well-trained. American aircraft were superior. American radar provided early warning and precise intercept vectors. Japanese pilots were inexperienced and poorly trained. Japanese aircraft were obsolete. Japanese radar was primitive, providing little tactical advantage. The battle began on the morning of June 19th, when Ozawa launched his first strike, 69 aircraft, including 45 Zero fighters. American radar detected the formation while it was still over 100 miles away, providing ample time to vector Hellcats into intercept position. Over 50 F-6F fighters formed a layered defense, positioned perfectly to catch the Japanese as they approached the fleet. The engagement was one-sided to the point of being almost surreal. Hellcats dove through the Japanese formation, shooting down aircraft with impunity. The Zero escorts, flown by poorly trained pilots, proved unable to protect the bombers or defend themselves. American pilots described it as shooting practice rather than combat. The Japanese formation disintegrated, with aircraft falling from the sky in flames or breaking apart under concentrated .50 caliber fire. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese strike, only 27 survived to reach the American fleet. Of those, most were shot down by anti-aircraft fire before they could attack. None scored significant hits. 42 aircraft destroyed for essentially no result. This was not war. This was slaughter. Ozawa, unaware of the catastrophic losses, launched a second strike, 107 aircraft, including 53 Zeros. American radar detected this formation as well, and Hellcats once again positioned themselves perfectly for intercept. The second engagement followed the same pattern as the first. Hellcats dove through the Japanese formation, destroying bombers and fighters with methodical efficiency. Few Japanese aircraft even reached the fleet, and those that did accomplished nothing. Ozawa launched 2 more strikes during the day, each time hoping his aircraft would break through and damage the American carriers. Each time, the Hellcats tore the formations apart. By late afternoon, Ozawa had launched 373 aircraft in 4 major strikes. Only 130 returned. 243 aircraft destroyed in a single day, along with the pilots who flew them. American losses totaled approximately 30 aircraft, most to anti-aircraft fire rather than combat. The kill ratio was over 8-1, and that understated the true disparity because it included losses to causes other than aerial combat. In actual fighter versus fighter engagements, the ratio approached 15 or even 20-1. This was the death of Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. The carefully husbanded air groups, the trained pilots, the aircraft reserves, all were gone, destroyed in one day of combat against an opponent they could not hope to defeat. American pilots, returning to their carriers after multiple sorties, were almost embarrassed by how easy the victory had been. One pilot described it as the greatest turkey shoot he had ever seen, and the name stuck. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a testament to how completely the Hellcat dominated its opponent. The strategic consequences were catastrophic for Japan. Naval aviation, the striking arm that had attacked Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific for 2 years, was finished. The carriers survived the battle physically, but without trained pilots and aircraft, they were merely floating targets. Japan would never again mount a serious carrier aviation challenge to American forces. From June 19, 1944 forward, American carriers operated with near impunity throughout the Pacific. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate battle. Japanese pilots who survived returned to their bases shattered, describing impossible odds and overwhelming American strength. The stories spread through Japanese aviation units, demoralizing pilots before they even entered combat. The mystique that had surrounded Japanese naval aviation since Pearl Harbor was completely destroyed, replaced by fatalistic resignation. American pilots, conversely, entered combat with supreme confidence, knowing their aircraft and tactics gave them overwhelming advantage. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.